about incorporating topography in soils, hydraulic parameters, scale algorithms. Please.
Thank you, Amare. And I would like to thank the organizers also for this opportunity. So let's go back to the first talk of this workshop by Dr. Van Genuchten, where he talked about unsaturated flows, and that is what I'll be also talking about. Much of this work was done when I was doing my PhD and my postdoc at Texas A&M, and some of it here at the Numerical Porous Media Center in Kaust, Saudi Arabia. So this is motivation. This is the hydrologic cycle, right? You have clouds, rainfall, precipitation, you have some surface runoff, you have infiltration into the soil, and you have the groundwater table, and there's also evaporation back into the clouds, right? So you have different processes here. You have infiltration processes, you have runoff processes, and you have global recharge processes. All of these processes work at different scales, and the models which we use to predict or characterize these processes also work at different scales, grid scales. So, and all of these processes, incidentally, use soil moisture in some form or the other as inputs. But it's physically impossible to measure the soil moisture value at all these scales individually, right? So the most common solutions to the problem is either use pedotransfer functions, which is where you obtain the soil hydraulic parameters or the soil moisture from other quantities which are more easily measured, or you use scaling schemes where you measure the soil moisture or the parameters at one scale and then you translate it to other scales. So the classical theory was that if you go from, on a spatial scale, go from point to a continental scale, the soil hydraulic properties or the soil moisture is across different scale boundaries, let's say. The soil hydraulic parameters were mostly governed by the variability in the soil texture and structure, right? This made sense. It's all soil moisture or soil hydraulic properties, so the soil governs everything. But we found that that might be true for small scales, maybe a few meters or a couple of 100 meters. But then as you go coarser, you have other features which can influence the soil moisture variability, such as maybe the topography or the vegetation or even the climate patterns, right? So with that, we formed a new hypothesis that maybe you have different physical controls of the soil moisture variability at different scales, such as like at the finer scales, soil texture and structure are the most dominant controls. But as you go closer towards, say, the watershed scale or the regional scale, then topography is more dominant. That is not to say that soil does not influence it anymore, but just that it has a lesser influence than the topography because of the overland flows or even the subsurface flows because of gravity and other topographic features. And then as you go closer, you have land cover patterns, such as like if you have a forested area versus a desert region, then the plants are the deciding factor in how much water is moving, right? So we started off trying to prove this hypothesis with taking just the topography into account. Before this, we have always been considering only the soil texture and structure as our drivers for the variability of soil moisture. So the causes of variation of soil hydraulic properties or soil moisture, they can be converted to each other, right? So basically, topography is vital in determining the soil formation and deposition patterns. So if you have a thicker soil layer versus a more thin soil layer, then your soil moisture is different. It's also the position along a slope. If you are in a valley versus at the top of a hill. So what we did was we generated different topographies synthetically, right? So this was one with a very gentle slope of 1 in 50 and it had some micro topography on the surface. And then you have another, which is a 1 in 5 slope, which is much steeper. You have a convex slope or a concave slope. So these are sort of idealized cases of topography that you would encounter in nature. So in nature, it would be a mix of this, but we started off simple. Right? We then sort of use or simulate these different topographies for soil moisture movement, and we also scale the soil hydraulic parameters and see if we can get an effective match. Right? We use something called the power averaging operator, which was introduced by Jaeger in the early 2000s. So it basically nudges the average towards a more probable value instead of taking just the mean. Right? So this is the form of that operator where this is the support of one variable to the other, one location to the other. So that support function has some requirements. It should be in the unit interval. It should be reversible, and also it should die off as the distance between the values increases. Right? And this is where it gets its name from. The form of that support function is a power law. Right? And here, this eta is what we would consider as a scale parameter, and for that, we used this formulation. Right? So the scale parameter is here a factor of the elevation difference between the two locations, and also the linear distance between the two locations being considered for scaling as a function of the scale to which we are upscaling. Right? We used Hydros 3D, which is a simulation model which solves for the Richards equation and can account for 3D flows, but unfortunately there's no inverse estimation, so we cannot just do it on a coarse scale and try to get back the effective parameters. Right. So the soil hydraulic parameters at the fine scale were assigned randomly to each node in the domain. We use the Van Genuchten form of the formulation for the soil retention curve. And these were the parameters, the residual and the saturation water contents, the saturated hydraulic conductivity, and the alpha and n were basically fitting parameters for the curves. Right? The boundary conditions, the top layer had a atmospheric boundary condition which allows for water movement into as well as out of the domain. So you can have both evaporation or transpiration and infiltration. The sites had something called a seepage phase where the water gets out only if that particular node is saturated. If it is not saturated, then the water accumulates there till it reaches saturation. And the bottom was free drainage, or depending on the water table depth, we had a variable head. Right. So we tried out different topographies, the 4 different topographies that I showed you earlier. We also tried it with different land cover to see if that gave any significant influence at these scales, and also different water tables and different initial soil distributions. So this is just an idea of all the different types of time-dependent boundary conditions, basically the evaporation and transpiration with different vegetations. So you either have a bare soil or grass, corn, or deciduous trees covering the domains. Right. So these are the results. So the top of the atmospheric boundary fluxes, these are for the 4 different cases of topography, and these are actually the different scales which are overlain one over the other. And you can see that they match almost perfect, right? And you can also see that for all 4 cases, the flux pattern was the same. And this was the same thing with the root water uptake from the vegetation also, right? But then as we go to the bottom boundary fluxes, the patterns changed, but you still have good match across scales. right? So the reason for these two fluxes being very similar to each other across the four topographies is they're all at the surface, the top surface, right? So the water or the dynamics there are more or less the same, but then as you get to the bottom boundary, the thickness of your domain and also how the thickness changes depending on the topography has a say in how these patterns evolve, right? And the same thing with the side boundaries too. Okay. So this was at the end of the simulation, which was we ran the simulation for 365 days, and see that the patterns, the soil moisture distribution is different in each of the cases, although they all had the same initial conditions. The soil distribution was the same, the inputs were the same, the precipitation forcings were the same. So you see that topography definitely has some influence on how the soil moisture patterns evolve and consequently the soil hydraulic properties, right? So if we are going to scale these, then we definitely need to use those. Some more analysis, how the soil moisture, average soil moisture of the domains changes with time across the four different topographies. We see that mostly the average soil moisture would reduce with time and as well as scale. As you go coarser, the soil moisture value was lower. This is another comparison between two different initial soil distributions. So this is at the fine scale, close to the fine scale, where you can see the different patterns because of the initial difference in the soil distribution. But as you go to the coarse scale, it starts getting more and more similar. Right? So all that is fine with a synthetic model, as Victor was saying just now, a toy model, right? That this was the equivalent of that, where we could control everything. So it's easy to get something good, but how does this work in the field? So we tried this out in different watersheds, and I'm showing the results from just one watershed here. So this domain was much larger. The earlier toy examples were of 1 kilometer size, the whole domain. And we also added surface flow components, which were not included in the original cases. Right, so this was the domain. It's called the Little Watershed in Oklahoma. It's about 670 square kilometers. So each of these grid cells is 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. Right? So it's equivalent to the test case that we did earlier. So we had elevation information, soil distribution, we had precipitation patterns, and also we had remote sensing soil moisture at the 1 kilometer scale for a few days in this region. So we can validate our upscaled values. We also had some meteorological stations which gives this, and there were a couple of stream gauges there using data from which we tried to close out the water balance. Right. And I'll be showing just results from 12 selected pixels. These pixels were selected based on the variety that they would offer in terms of topography or the land cover or the soil distribution. Right. So just an idea of the different data that goes into it: elevations, land cover, soil survey, and also the precipitation, temperature, humidity, and the remotely sensed soil moisture. Again, the boundary conditions were very similar: atmospheric boundary at the top, seepage phase on the sides, and variable head depending on the actual water table that we had data for that region. So 672 1 kilometer resolution pixels had to be simulated for each day, and unfortunately at that time the software did not have the ability to give me the surface runoff. So I had to do that offline and then route it to the downstream pixel, update the soil moisture there offline, do these things offline, and then run it again for the next day. Right? But now a lot of it is included in that software. So I ran the simulation for 3 months, but we usually discard the first couple of months to let the model understand the system, and the last 1 month was where we used for analysis, and that's also the time when we had the remote sensing soil moisture to compare with. So these were the 12 different pixels that I'm going to talk about. So you can see the different topographies. You have different patterns of topography. You have some which are monotonically just reducing or rising, and you have some which have multimodal topographies. So the highest elevation was at 446 meters, and the lowest was about 100 meters lower. So you have a good relief in the topography. The different kinds of land cover, some were pastures, some were wheat, which is agriculture, so the land management practice is different, and some were bare soil. The CTI is a compound topographic index, and it gives you an idea about how complex or simple the topography is. So the lower the number, the more complex the topography. So it has a lot more variations within your domain. And the higher the number, it is simpler. And maybe it's just monotonically reducing topography. Right? And we had different water table depths and different number of soils or different soil types within the pixels. So there was just a distribution of the soils within those pixels. Some had a much more distribution than some which had just a couple of soils, which would be easier. Right? So the red lines here were the upscaled surface soil moisture with no flow routing, so which is similar to what we did in the test cases or the synthetic case. The black lines are with the addition of the flow routing, which was done offline, as I explained earlier, and the blue lines are our measurements. Right? So we got pretty good matches with all of them, generally. Right? So again, front comparison, so would be fine scale with no flow routing and the coarse scale with no flow routing. So even without the flow routing, you have a pretty good matches. And this is with the flow routing. So naturally, you can see that there's more soil moisture being captured with the flow routing. So the correlations between the fine and the coarse scale, we did that as a function of how wet or dry the domain was, to see if we could also see any patterns between the wetness of the soil. So you could see that they were all pretty good, but as you go drier, the correlations start going further away, right, going down. And this is with the measurements. This should actually be coarse versus the ester, sorry. So with the measured soil moisture, we got about the lowest was about 60% match, which is pretty good for our usage. This was without the runoff, and with the runoff was about 70-something. Right? And also, as I said, we had these two stream gauges, so we're trying to close out the water balance to see if we can capture all the fluxes and the soil moisture. So if we had done it right, then we should have a pretty good match with the data from these two. So this is the one upstream, so you have lower discharge, and this box is the time frame where we are doing the analysis, and we got a pretty good match there. And this was the downstream pixel with much more variability, but still when you correct for the lag, you get a pretty good match. Right? So, okay, so this works pretty well, but how does this work in comparison with some other upscaling methods? So our group at Texas A&M, we had been working on scaling of soil moisture for some time now, and we had a few different methods in-house. So we just thought we'd compare it just with those and see how they do. So this is the topography-based method that I just described. This is a simple homogenization developed by Jianting Zhu, who is now at Renault. And then there's a MCMC-based method developed by Naren Das, who is in JPL now at NASA. And this was another one that I had developed earlier in my PhD using the Bayesian neural networks. It turns out that at the more complex topographic pixels, the topography-based and the neural networks-based methods work better than the other two. But if you go to the simpler topographies, they were all more or less the same, or in some cases, the others work better. And then when you go back and see, these two methods do not incorporate topography in any way. The Bayesian neural networks had elevation as one of its inputs. And this, of course, is based on topography, right? So basically, at coarser or more complex topographies, including the topography into the scaling algorithm made a significant difference in how the scaling algorithm performed. Right? So with that, I think these are some of the papers which were published based on this work. And that. So thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Question?